session 2. I'm your moderator for the session. My name is Jung. Session 2, the topic is state politics, imperialism, and counterculture. We have 3 presenters. Let's get started with Agatha Jung. Agatha is currently a sophomore here at City College. She's majoring in Spanish and economics. And as you can see, her presentation is on Brazil and South Korea. Autocracies, necessary evils.
Thank you. Brazil and South Korea, autocracies, necessary evils. The end of World War II brought upon a new world order, and along with it, new superpowers set to dominate the international stage. Many countries struggled with the emergence of authoritarian governments during the times which the world attempt to align themselves with certain political ideologies. Prime examples of such are South Korea and Brazil. After World War II, South Korea was forcibly separated into independent states due to the influences of strict totalitarian leaders in both the communist and capitalist spectrums. Although it may not have been partitioned into 2 nations, Brazil also struggled with aligning themselves ideologically. The climates of political instability gave the opportunity to specific authoritarian rulers to seize power and implement policies they thought would legitimize their military coups in order to help them maintain the power they have acquired. Presidents Getulio Vargas of Brazil and Chung Park of South Korea are examples of 2 leaders who have both seized power of their respective governments through military coups and were villainized by their populations because of their leniency to the oppression of citizens' rights. However, through the installments of these authoritarian governments, South Korea and Brazil were able to create foundations for their countries by building necessary infrastructures and developing key industries to further advancement of their economic growths. Furthermore, due to the extreme oppression of human rights, authoritarian governments additionally fostered many anti-authoritarian movements, which sped the process of democratization of the 2 countries. Through the lenses of these 2 countries, an autocratic government is seen to be a necessary evil in order for the nations to have been able to achieve the level of industrialization that they experienced. Throughout Brazil's history, there were many uprisings, such as the infamous abduction of the ambassador of the United States in 1969 by the student group, the MRA, portrayed in the film directed by Bruno Barreto called 4 Days in September. On the other side of the world, in South Korea, a famous student demonstration against the authoritarian government was called the Gwangju Democratization Movement, or the May 18th Uprising. These 2 demonstrations were not only the result of an anti-dictatorial government, but also displayed the diversity of thoughts. The emphasis expands and includes the struggle for human rights and civil rights to freedom by advocating for less corrupt governments. The creation of North Korea has become a source of constant political struggle for South Korea because of its relative proximity and the strong communist influence, which threatened the livelihood of South Korea's soon-to-develop economy. Under these seemingly legitimate pretenses of trying to counter North Korea's influence, many of the political elite were able to adopt very strong rhetoric. In turn, the governments were labeled as authoritarian, often punishing political rivals and its civilian population in an effort to deter the people from identifying themselves from either left or right-wing politics. Regardless of the violations of rights and corruption of these regimes, the authoritarian leaders were able to create a foundation and in the long term transform a tiny country's economy into the 14th strongest economy of the world today. After the Revolution of April 1960, Chung Park staged a military coup against the government installed by the U.S. and creates a nationalistic government with intentions to develop South Korea's rural land. During this time, South Korea was heavily dependent on the United States militarily and economically. South Korea struggled with keeping the North at bay, and the U.S. had interests to aid the South in order to prevent the expansion of the Soviet bloc. Park was extremely nationalistic. This dependence pushed Park to quickly transform South Korea's economy so it can be independent of Washington, D.C.'s influence. Park's Yushin era has begun. Park's 3 5-year plans put in place between 1961 and 1979 are also shown to be tremendous successes. According to the World Bank, the economic reforms reduced poverty from 40% in 1965 to 10% in 1980. The first of the total 3 economic 5-year plans declared, the economic system will be a form of guided capitalism. The notion of guided capitalism laid the groundwork for the embrace of free enterprise and state intervention where deemed fit. With state facilitation, Park created work-related propaganda with the famous slogan, "Steel is power." South Korea set to industrialize itself through the emphasis on heavy industries such as the manufacturing of steel and Korea's shipbuilding industry. The last 5-year plan was Park's legacy, and it also secured the future of South Korea's economy. The ambitious plan, known as the Heavy and Chemical Industry Promotion Plan, focused on 6 industries: iron and steel, non-ferrous metals, meaning any metals without iron, shipbuilding, chemicals, electronics, and machinery. The state promoted the creation of chaebols, which are family-run conglomerates, by awarding building contracts and awarding policy loans. These are loans handed out by Park's administration to private enterprises which have won government bids to create an infrastructure for quick industrialization. Many chaebols are still prevalent in modern-day Korea, such as Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and Daewoo. The creation of a fantastic economic strategy was not the only way Park sought to minimize dependency on the U.S. For instance, in order to finance these new economic reforms, Park signed a reparations agreement with Japan in order to receive an immediate capital of $800 million. This decision remains highly controversial to this day because of the colonization of Korea pre-World War II was a source of much grief for many Koreans. The importance of industrialization and development forced democracy and human rights to take a back seat. The end of the Korean War in 1953 brought a new constitution and important labor laws, which stated the workers' rights to organize unions freely, bargain collectively, and engaging in collective actions, all of which Park revoked by 1972. After Park's coup, he declared martial law for 2 years, known as the Supreme Council of National Reconstruction, during which he suspended all civil and political rights, arresting 2,000 opposing politicians, and dismissed 13,000 civil servants and military officers. Throughout Park's regime, the Korean Central Intelligence Agency was also accused of torturing civilians and reporting some to mysteriously vanish. The air of political suppression and civilian insecurity became the driving force behind future protests against dictatorial governments. Coupled with the strength of labor movements, student demonstrations developed into fervent voices of politics and social justice. On May 15, 1980, approximately 500 people took to the streets of the city Gwangju to protest against the newly formed authoritarian regime of Chun, who grasped power after Park's assassination in 1979. Known as the Gwangju Massacre, at least 500 people have been killed, along with some 960 people missing, after 3 days of the military brutally suppressing civilian protesters comprised of laborers and students. According to a first-hand testimony by Chun, the student could not run away. The soldiers kicked him with their military boots and hit him with the butts of their guns, and later loaded him onto a 3/4-ton vehicle. The military were excessively physical. They shot, beat, and tortured many of the protesters to try to stop the spread of the uprising. Like the man Chun saw being loaded into a truck, many other Koreans were also taken by the military. To this day, the discrepancy of the number of deaths and disappearances in relation to the massacre prompts Koreans to believe that the Chun's military were responsible for secret burials. This movement is the most famous of uprisings in South Korea. By this time, the economic development of South Korea brought the distribution of new ideas, and students already saw the military as a group that was intellectually inferior. The inclusion of unions of laborers and intellectuals drove the levels of political participation to a maximum. The massacre pushed forward the importance of social justice, and many politicians who were supporters of democracy became increasingly popular. Politicians such as Jung would later be democratically elected as the president of South Korea. The unison of popular sentiment sped the process of South Korea's transfer from an autocratic to a democratic nation.